Right, today's task is to deal with this Retina IIa camera that's come to me for service. It's got a number of issues. The shutter does work. The focus is extremely stiff, extremely stiff. It's very hard to shift that. It about breaks my thumb doing that. The rangefinder, strangely enough, is relatively accurate, and it's even relatively easy to see through. But the camera will need to be completely stripped down. You can see it's had a bit of a hard life. It's lost a lot of paint on the back here, and this is the remains of adhesive tape. Somebody has stuck probably instructions for film. That's typically what you see on the back there, exposure instructions for film, to the back of that, and somebody else has ripped it off at a later date, taking some of the finish of the leather and the paint off the edge of the door with it. I'll clean up the leather as much as I can. I'm not going to repaint the door. So the camera is just otherwise fairly unremarkable. A fairly, I suppose you'd say a scruffy example of a Retina IIa. I certainly see prettier ones. I noticed that the film advance is just a little bit reluctant to return at the end of the stroke. May mean that the take-up spool shaft there, the advanced shaft, has got a twist in it. That can cause problems. Basically what happens is that the film advance lever here reaches the end of its advanced stroke before the cam below it on the same shaft reaches the end of the stroke to release the wind for the return. So that could easily be what's going on there, or it could just be a bit gummy, that the catch is not popping up out of place. So my task is to strip this down. Right, I'll just line up a few containers for my parts, and first thing I want to do, I think, is remove the shutter assembly. So the tool I'm using to do this is this particular one, Bellows USA. Unfortunately, Mr. Bellows doesn't make those anymore, as far as I know. But it's a great tool, particularly for the Retina IIa. Remove the lens, remove the retaining ring, onto the next piece. Alright, shutter and retaining ring and the shims can all be put aside, put in a container for later work, and can carry on stripping down the body. So I'll start with the rewind knob. I just put the tweezers through the fork to stop it turning. Then unscrew the rewind knob with your fingers. You can see some bright spark has made a mess of this one. See if I can get that so you can see it. Big scratches across here. Someone's had a tool in there. There was never any need for that. Pop that to one side. That little shim, that little spacer comes out from underneath. We need to deal with our film advance lever next. This time I will use the pin spanner. Unscrew that. That and its associated washer can go in the tub with screws. Take the lever off. We've got a number of pieces here. The top cover, which doesn't go through the cleaner. If that went through the cleaner, it would strip the paint out of the little markers and the arrowhead, so we can't have that. This piece can certainly go through the cleaner. The scale ring, that does not go through the cleaner. This can go through the cleaner, so can its washer. Now, this is the frame counter spring or ball. It's not broken. That's the tip there that breaks off. This is present. They're very fragile. I don't muck around with those. If that looks like it's whole and it works, don't test it, just reuse it. The lever itself, there's not much to say. There's a spring-loaded little lever attached in here, it's spring-loaded. That stops the film advance moving when you reach the end of the film. I'm just making sure that that does move smoothly. That all appears good. Sometimes if the camera has reached the end of the film and someone is exceptionally heavy-handed and enthusiastic, they will try and force the film advance lever. This catch gets damaged. So watch for that. The top cover, 2 screws. These are chrome plated brass, easily damaged, so be fairly cautious with them. The top cover should lift off. That'll need to be stripped and cleaned. The shutter release, a spacer collar there, that can go through the cleaner. The spring I put aside with the screws and bits and pieces. The main shaft can go through the cleaner. The shutter release button can go through the cleaner, and so can that small spacer ring. The film release button sitting on the top of the camera. Now that's interesting. That was sitting there, that should have just popped up. It didn't pop up because it's lost its spring. So someone's been in here before and the spring was missing. Now from here on in, well, we remove the rangefinder next, I think. 2 screws. So far we've got one missing part, that spring, which I shall probably be able to find. I'll find one in my spares. Pop the rangefinder aside for later cleaning. The rewind shaft and its collar I will remove now. There's not really much to go wrong here. All that we're really interested in is removing any dust and grit and dried grease, just so that it moves smoothly, and very importantly that the centre part will slide up smoothly. That's very stiff, so when you want to rewind the film, the whole shaft doesn't pull out of the film cartridge, just the knob lifts up into the rewind position. That's very gummy, will certainly benefit from a clean. Go back to the film advance. Lift off that spacer ring, that can go through the cleaner. And that gear, I want that off. That will certainly go through the cleaner. I can pull out our cocking rack on the Retina IIa. They're very hard to damage. They're not something that gets damaged. Just release this spring and release the tension on the film advance at the same time. 3 screws hold this. One holds that spring. Don't lose that. I don't have any spares. That spring goes to one side. 2 more screws. The screws over there. This gear here couples our drive to the cocking rack. Pop that aside for cleaning. This little cam here that pops up, and it's got a related spring here. I'm just checking that it's got the right one. Yes, it has. That certainly needs to be cleaned. That cam needs to be cleaned. There's a fine spring here and I don't put that through the cleaner. These 2 components need to be cleaned. Looking at those, they are quite dirty. That'll be dust and old grease. That little cam I just took off there is the ratchet, which stops the film from being able to roll backwards. Here I find that the 3 screws holding the top of the film advance bush here to the body are loose, so that's flopping around a bit. That may or may not have had some bearing on the film advance not wanting to return as smoothly as I'd like. That'll all need cleaning. Here's the clutch. The clutch drives the take-up spool. It allows some slippage between the take-up spool and the film sprocket, so that as the film builds up on the take-up spool it allows more and more slip. Otherwise the film sprocket would be ripping the holes, it would be pulling the film across the stationary sprocket, or at a faster rate than the sprocket's moving, and it would wreck the film. That's pretty much it for the top of the camera. For the bottom of the camera, I want to remove the surround here from the tripod bush. Now at this point I noticed something. The leather, I'll see if I can get that to catch the light for you just right. The leather shows a line right across here. Now that tells me that someone has had this apart before and they've peeled the leather back. Now you always get a line like that where you peel the leather back part of the way and then glue it back down. It never goes down smoothly. And the answer to avoid getting a line like that or a crease in the leather is you have to pull it back further. You have to expose it even further than you need to do the job. They've pulled it back this far. That means they probably needed the screw to get the Bellows struts out. I will peel the leather all the way back to this point. We'll still get a crease, but it'll be at this point. It'll be invisible. It won't be obvious like this. So I need to find a scalpel. Alright, let's get this leather off. This has been removed before and re-glued, so it's stuck down somewhat firmer than they normally are. I don't know what they've used for adhesive. It feels quite hard. Hopefully not epoxy. Anything's a possibility. Fortunately the leather is relatively tough and hardly ever splits. Here I'm using a small screwdriver to scrape the leather clear around that narrow spot. It's hard to get the scalpel to slide down smoothly over this because there's a couple of screw heads there for the blade to catch on. That line across the leather is right at that point. That tells me the leather was peeled back that far previously. I'll lift off the tripod socket. Tripod sockets are usually loose. That one's not bad, presumably because when whoever had been into it previously for whatever reason and had lifted the leather at that stage, you had the opportunity to check those screws and tighten them. A choice of screwdriver. These two brass screws usually have corrosion on the top where they sit against the leather. One just got away there, I'll have to hunt that one down. And carry on with this. This glue is exceptionally difficult to work with. It sticks really well, and I've got to slide my scalpel down underneath the glue layer, between the glue layer and the metal body ideally. If you tried to scrape between the glue layer and the leather, you'd end up cutting through the leather. Now at this point you see that the leather starts to lift off easily. It's because this is the original glue point at this stage down here. That leather's a bit fragmented there. If I push this, add creases down to this point, they'll be effectively invisible when I glue the leather back. That's it, that's as far as I need to go. So all these scraps have to be cleaned off, any loose pieces of leather removed. But that'll glue down, we'll have a continuous sweep of leather down there. That crease will probably disappear when we get to that stage. Of course we're not putting it back together yet. The rewind button looks particularly ugly. I think that's mostly glue I can see on it, but it may be scratches or damage from whatever they used to remove it. I've got a special pair of pliers made for doing that job, and they work particularly well. And making tools like that is a fairly simple process. You buy the cheapest, nastiest pliers you can find because the steel will be softest, and all I did was shorten them back, so we needle nose pliers, set it in the vise, run a drill bit into there, a small one and then a larger one to the right diameter. You could harden them after that if you wanted to go to the trouble, but for our purposes it wasn't necessary. It's mostly being used on brass and aluminium. Right, so we take out the spool, the sprocket. This is the rewind lever, rewind button lever here. And there's the little lever that catches the rewind. Three screws here. This is the film advance shaft. Shaft comes out, one of the springs. Saw that as the perfect opportunity to disappear into the distance. It's on the floor. Catch that later. There's our shaft and its return spring. It's very gritty feeling, bit of sand in there I'd say. Now the film sprocket will come out, the film take-up spool. There's its metal bush which certainly needs to go through the cleaner. Hinge pins for the front door, one at the top, one at the bottom. Now this is interesting, this has got three little pinpoint punch marks around that. Somebody has tried to squeeze in the metal at that point and at the bottom. Suggests that those pins might have been, the holes might have been too large. That's a very unusual problem. Where they've centre punched it, it actually comes over the screw slightly there, so it's a bit hard to get that screw to back out neatly. I think there may have been an element of overkill there. Perhaps they were trying to stop the screws from being able to back out and get lost. A small shim washer top and bottom of the hinge points. Lift the door off. Has its two paper, cartridge paper shim washers with it. They're still present. And we're down to the focus mechanism at this point. So remove this screw here. This is from the arm that moves the rangefinder. Two screws here hold that coupling to the focus helical. So as the focus helical moves in and out, it moves that arm, and that arm in turn moves the rangefinder. I'm looking at this point to see if there's any sign that the focus scale ring has shifted on the focus helical. It's very stiff. It would not be at all unusual for that to happen. I can see an alignment mark running directly across here. That suggests that it's all correctly placed. I'm going to run my own alignment marks. Which will be done so I'm marking the alignment of their focus scale ring, the chrome piece, with the brass outer helical. I'll run two lines at this side and one line diagonally opposite. Then I'll want to align my inner and outer helical to that together as well. But immediately all I want to do is lift off this focus scale ring. I could feel some movement in the struts when I pressed on that screw. It tells me that the struts are possibly a little bit bent, possibly a little bit loose. Something to be aware of when I'm cleaning and checking them. Lift off the scale ring. Now if I align my inner and outer helical so that this front surface is absolutely level. That's the point I want to make my mark. I want to extend those marks I made across the inner helical now. Two marks on that side and one on this side. You can choose your own pattern for doing things like that. All that's required is that you have some method of being able to instantly recognise where components were supposed to be aligned. If the focus is correct before you take something apart and you reassemble the focus helical components to go back exactly where they came out, then the focus will be just as accurate when you reassemble the camera. And I've found that to be the case. That grease is very, very stiff. Alright, one screw either side here holds this shroud in place, excuse me, and the shroud in turn holds the coupling gear and shaft in place and its support. This piece doesn't go through the ultrasonic cleaners that would lift the green paint out of the M&X letterings there. 4 screws hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're the black screws. The bellows will normally just fall back out of the way once they're unscrewed. Four screws hold the focus mount to the back of the front standard. They're loose, or 2 of them are loose, 3 of them are loose. Get those screws back. This piece I clean by hand, I don't put it through the ultrasonic cleaner. It's got a felt light trap on the back and it's painted black, and the black paint would be all completely gone if it went into the ultrasonic. That's one of the screws I lost earlier, it's just surfaced. So I want to remove the Bellows struts from the camera. One screw at the top here. Usually they're very tight. That one was not abnormally tight. It was fairly easy to shift. That one has come loose easily too. And the other 2 are here in the film chamber. They're usually tight, and they are certainly tight. They'll need some more work. Those of you familiar with motorbikes and working on them will be familiar with the concept of using impact drivers. Well, this impact driver is just a very solid screwdriver, and the twist motion has to be put in by hand, but it does work the same. Couple of taps, keeping some pressure on that screwdriver. That screw comes loose, and probably its mate will do the same. Yep. You can't go overboard when hammering screws like that on the camera, because the camera body is made of aluminium casting and it's reasonably soft. So I can lift out the Bellows struts. They come out like that, and I can immediately see that they are a little bit bent, nothing too dramatic. So transfer shaft that transfers the action from the shutter cocking rack at the back of the camera through to this gear on the front of that shaft, and then to the shutter itself. There's a return spring for the shutter release mechanism, one spacer washer from the bottom of the camera, one bracket there which held our gear in place at the back of the camera, much like that. And the body is stripped down as far as I need to strip it. So those components will have to be, these ones go into the ultrasonic cleaner. These will be cleaned by hand, as will the other components here. The Bellows struts mechanism here, it's quite dusty and dirty. Pieces that should be straight are not quite straight. Pieces that should be bent are bent, but they're bent in a less than satisfactory manner. So I'll have to clean that up, reshape things to my liking, and I would expect those Bellows struts to fit much better. Right, as you can see, I have had got rid of all the sticky tape and bits of paper and other rubbish from the back of that camera. Did that quite successfully on the leather. I've treated the leather with some renovating polish, which is a very soft wax, penetrates quite well. Carries a lot of colour, and the back of that camera now looks quite good. I expect it's certainly a vast improvement over the mess it was previously. So now I can carry on cleaning the rest of this body and then clean all the other components.